You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thank you for joining the American Revolution. This week, episode 323, The Evacuation of Charleston. The last time we looked in on Charleston was in episode 316. The Continental Army, under General Nathaniel Greene, maintained a blockade around Charleston by land, confronting any foraging parties that dared to move outside the city. The British still controlled the waters and could supply the garrison by sea. In August, Colonel John Lawrence had been killed in one of the confrontations led against those foraging parties. Even in the fall of 1782, General Greene remained on alert for a new British offensive. The British had consolidated more soldiers in Charleston after evacuating Savannah, Georgia, earlier that summer. The British naval victory in the West Indies had removed the French fleet as a threat and gave the British more flexibility in where they might provide reinforcements for a new offensive. Skirmishing between the two sides continued into the fall. At the end of August, just days after Lawrence's death, a Patriot detachment from General Francis Marion's battalion, under the command of Captain George Sinclair Capers, attacked a detachment of Loyalist dragoons. Another concern for the Americans was the Cherokee, who had remained British allies and had several times attempted to provide support for the Charleston garrison. In mid-September, General Andrew Pickens and Colonel Elijah Clark led a force of over 400 militia into the backcountry to destroy several Indian villages that were seen as potential support areas for future Indian raids. There also remained the concern of Loyalists still living within American lines. In October, Patriots received intelligence regarding a meeting of Loyalists at Saltcatcher Swamp. They sent a militia company, commanded by Captain John Carter, to break up that meeting. The militia rode into a Loyalist ambush. After a brief but fierce skirmish, the Loyalists retreated into the swamp. One of the final skirmishes of any size took place when the British deployed a foraging party to James Island in search of firewood. Colonel Thaddeus Kosciuszko led a force of 70 Continentals to harass the foraging party. When the Continentals arrived, they discovered the foragers were accompanied by a much larger force. They faced over 300 British soldiers, along with an enemy field cannon. Despite being outnumbered more than 4-1, the Americans attacked. In a relatively short exchange of fire, the Americans lost 5 killed, including Captain William Wilmot of the Maryland Line, and 5 more wounded, including Lieutenant John Markland of the Pennsylvania Line. Colonel Kosciuszko found himself in the thick of fighting. The enemy shot and shattered a pontoon that he was holding. A British dragoon nearly killed Kosciuszko before another American soldier cut down the dragoon. After the battle, Kosciuszko found 4 bullet holes in his coat. Following this brief encounter, the Americans withdrew. This continued fighting would not impact the final outcome. Months earlier, the British commander in North America, General Guy Carleton, had begun preparations for the evacuation of Charleston. Carleton had succeeded General Henry Clinton after the British surrender at Yorktown. His primary mission was to wrap up British operations and leave with as little further harm as possible. General Carleton was not happy with his mission and in fact requested to be relieved of command. The fall of the North government made clear that the British Army was not going to carry out any further military operations. The general also had authority to try to negotiate some sort of peace with America if it would agree to some sort of continued relation with Britain. Since the Americans made clear that was a non-starter, Carleton's efforts as a peace commissioner came to a quick end. Carleton wrote to his superiors in London that he did not want, quote, only to be employed as a mere inspector of embarkations. He demanded that he be transferred to a combat role in Europe. Prime Minister Shelburne's Home Secretary, Thomas Townsend, denied the general's request and persuaded him that he had a duty to clean up the remaining forces in America. The process of removing tens of thousands of soldiers from the North American continent, along with tens of thousands of Loyalist civilians and their property, was no easy task in the age of sail, especially when the enemy was still ready to fight. By November, when the Battle of James Island took place under Colonel Kosciuszko, British transport ships were already in Charleston Harbor preparing for the final evacuation. The British commander in Charleston, General Alexander Leslie, had already tried to establish a temporary truce with the Americans, only to be denied. With the British evacuation imminent, the British attempted to establish a few agreements. One such agreement was on behalf of the British merchants in Charleston. They obtained permission from General Leslie and from South Carolina Governor John Matthews to remain in the city for 18 months after the evacuation in order to dispose of their goods and collect debts owed to them. Another concern for the Americans was the removal of about 5,000 slaves that were under British possession in Charleston. Many of these had either run away or been captured by the British or loyalist soldiers. The Americans demanded the return of these people and other captured property looted by the British. General Leslie agreed in general that he would try to prevent the removal of any looted property, including slaves. The Americans, however, continued to push the British. During the first couple of weeks of December, the British began loading men and supplies onto various ships they had available. On the night of December 12th and into the morning of December 13th, General Anthony Wayne led a division of Continental soldiers toward Charleston. He led 300 light infantry, along with 80 cavalry, from the corps previously led by Colonel Light Horse Harry Lee and Colonel John Lawrence. General Wayne also had with him 2 6-pounder field cannons. Wayne crossed the river north of town at Ashley Ferry, marching south toward the British fortifications. General Greene had ordered him to do whatever he could to harass the enemy as they prepared to evacuate. Before General Wayne's force reached the British lines, General Leslie sent a note carried by a local civilian. Leslie told Wayne that if the Americans allowed the British to evacuate without further harassment, the British would not destroy Charleston and would not fire on the American troops once the British were aboard their ships in the harbor. If, however, the Americans did attack, Leslie said he would not be held accountable for the consequences. Wayne acceded to this and pulled back to have his men make camp until the following day. The British agreed to fire a signal cannon on the morning of December 14th, when they had evacuated and when the Americans could advance to take possession of the town. That same day, General Greene moved the bulk of his army across Ashley Ferry toward Charleston as well. Greene received word of the deal and camped his army a few miles behind Wayne's encampment. With Greene were Governor Matthews and General Moultrie. Part of the army had already crossed the river, while a portion of them remained on the other side of the river overnight. The following morning, the British fired their signal cannon, and Wayne began to march his troops south toward Charleston. At around 11 a.m., Wayne reached the British outer fortifications about a mile and a half north of the southernmost tip of the Charleston Peninsula. The lead troops saw a few Hessian Jaegers still guarding the main gate into town, and those troops began to fall back at the sight of the enemy. The Americans approached to speak with them, learning that General Leslie had ordered all civilians to remain in their homes in order to minimize interference with the final evacuation and to avoid any misunderstandings that might cause a firefight. British gunships remained on alert on the Ashley and Cooper rivers on both sides of the city, ready to open fire if the Americans tried to attack any of the final soldiers evacuating Charleston. As the British withdrew south toward the docks, Wayne advanced. On a few occasions, the British called out that Wayne was getting a little too close. He would halt his men and allow the British a little more space, trying to leave about 200 yards between the two sides. Wayne's men observed the final British soldiers withdraw south of the city gates and march to Gadsden's Wharf on the Cooper River for final boarding. Wayne then deployed his men in smaller detachments around town to reconnoiter and make sure everything was clear. As Wayne's soldiers spread through Charleston, General Greene, along with Generals Gist and Moultrie and Governor Matthews, along with the Privy Council and leading citizens, began marching toward the city from a point about 9 miles to the north. At about 3 p.m., the group, which included about 50 VIPs accompanied by 80 cavalry, entered Charleston. Some went to survey the town. Others met up with friends who had remained in Charleston during the occupation. Just offshore were over 130 enemy ships preparing to depart to open sea. For many civilians, the departure of the British was a welcome event for celebration. For many loyalists left behind, it was only the beginning of a nightmare. Despite the time and ships, many civilians had to be left behind. Over 5,000 soldiers, including loyalist militia, nearly 4,000 white civilians, and over 5,000 slaves had been evacuated. General Leslie had ignored his promise not to prevent the removal of captured slaves. Even so, many loyalists decided to remain in Charleston. For many, the thought of leaving their homes to be settled on some island in the West Indies, where most of the new inhabitants died of disease within a few months, or moving to frigid Canada, was just too much to bear. They chose to take their chances under the new Patriot government. A British officer wrote his own description of the evacuation of civilians, which I will read. The inhabitants and merchants who thought proper to remain in town were directed to keep within their houses. All stores and warehouses were shut up. The streets, formerly crowded and cheerful to the view, now presented one mournful scene of the most complicated wretchedness. The poor, unhappy loyalists, whom the British government not many months before had most solemnly pledged its faith to protect in their persons and properties, were now left victims to their merciless enemies, or to be sent on board vessels for the West Indies to encounter with their distressed families every misfortune, and to suffer every species of indigence and want in a strange land. Many indeed remained in the town, preferring the risk of immediate death to the cruel uncertainty of adhering any longer to a government whose perfidy and treachery stands unparalleled in the annals of history. But by far the greater number, whose activity in the cause of the King and the British Constitution left no hopes for mercy, embarked, as these passed the windows of their friends and acquaintances, in their way to the places of embarkation, they silently, with grief unutterable, bowed their last farewell. This melancholy salute was returned with feelings that could only be expressed by tears and sobs. The gloomy despair sat on every countenance, and all wretchedness and woe. The scene was too affecting for description, too great for human feelings. Even the most obdurate and unprincipled of your patriots, had he been present at this awful view, must have felt some remorse for the part he has acted, and lamented the falsities he has palmed on Parliament as facts, and which have brought the most complicated ruin and misery on thousands and thousands, whose only crime has been loyalty to the King and affection for their parent country. Throughout the whole of this transaction, though the most melancholy one I have ever beheld, it must be observed to the honor of the officer who commanded that the whole has been conducted with the utmost attention and humanity as far as it rested with him. Certain places were appointed for embarkation, sentinels were fixed to prevent plunder being taken off by the soldiers and seamen, the vessels were all searched, and whatever plunder was found was returned to the inhabitants of the town from whom it was taken. Now, according to other accounts, the Americans treated the locals with civility. The British, who remained in port for several more days, noted that the Americans were polite enough not to raise their flag over the city, and they even returned a few sailors who had missed the final evacuations. There is at least one loyalist account that painted a very different picture of the turnover of the city. Some said the Americans hanged as many as 24 loyalists before the British ships sailed away. They also say that at least 130 loyalists who remained in Charleston were rounded up and imprisoned. One account reports loyalists being whipped, tarred, and feathered, dragged by horses, dunked in ponds, etc. These accounts, however, are hotly disputed. They seem to go against the majority of the accounts written. Most witnesses on both sides report that the turnover was organized and civil, and these accusations of ill treatment seem to come from people who were not eyewitnesses to the events themselves. Another account noted that 4 loyalists had been killed sometime after the evacuation, These were what we would call today revenge killings by men who had grudges against the individuals who were involved. In all 4 of those cases, the murderers were prosecuted as criminals. By the following Monday, after the evacuation, Greene declared the city was open for business and restored to civilian rule. Greene wrote to Washington a few days later, and he reported, quote, "The people are once more free, and I hope will manifest their gratitude by a vigorous exertion in support of the common cause." A month later, the South Carolina legislature resumed its session in Charleston, opening on January 24, 1783. Governor Matthews, in his remarks at the opening of the session, noted his agreement to allow certain merchants to remain in Charleston for 18 months and that they would be protected from any retribution. For other loyalists, though, who had remained in Charleston without any agreement or permission, Matthews said the following: "After my entrance into this town, I found a number of persons here who had formerly been citizens of this state, but who had continued to reside under British government in Charleston until its dissolution, whose cases it was thought advisable, we, by the Privy Council, to refer to the General Assembly. It is therefore left with you to decide on their future destiny." There are also in this town a number of persons who are British subjects and who remained here after the evacuation without any condition on the part of this state. I have considered most of them as prisoners to the state and have paroled them accordingly, until the meeting of the legislature. It now remains with you to determine on their several cases. For the most part, it seems that South Carolina was ready to put the war behind it and return to peaceful civilian rule. Many of those who left with the British fleet, however, were permanently banned from returning. British records show that a majority of civilians who left went to Jamaica or East Florida. Only about 10% of the total went to England, Halifax, or New York. The slaves that departed mostly remained enslaved by Loyalist or British masters. Some of them were sold to plantations in other parts of the West Indies. A small portion of the slaves who had escaped Patriot masters and provided military service to the British Army remained free and were resettled along with other Loyalist evacuees. Charleston did not learn about the preliminary peace treaty until April of 1783. Until then, Governor Matthews focused in part on rebuilding Charleston defenses in anticipation of another attack. After word of the treaty arrived, though, most of these plans were shelved. General Moultrie, writing an account many years later, described the evacuation as a glorious event. Quote, "I cannot forget the happy day when we marched into Charleston with the American troops. It was a proud day to me, and I felt myself much elated at seeing the balconies, the doors, and windows crowded with patriotic fare and aged citizens and others, congratulating us on our return home, saying, 'God bless you, gentlemen. You are welcome home, gentlemen.' Both citizens and soldiers shed mutual tears of joy. It was an ample reward for the triumphant soldier, after all the hazards and fatigues of war which he had gone through, to be the instrument of releasing his friends and fellow citizens from captivity and restoring to them their liberties and possession of their city and country again. This 14th day of December, 1782, ought never to be forgotten by Carolinians. It ought to be a day of festivity with them, and it was the real day of their deliverance and independence." While the war itself was winding to an end, the coming peace raised new controversies, particularly from the Continental Army, which wanted the government to keep its promises for the service of its soldiers. Next week, we're going to take a look at how that's going as General Washington deals with a potential revolt by the Army in Newburgh, New York. Hey, thanks for joining the American Revolution Podcast After Show, part of the Airwave Media Network. Thanks to my Patreon supporters in the Alexander Hamilton Club, George Davis, Mike Hager, John Celentano, and Michael Mulhern. And thanks to Robert Morris Circle supporters Curtis Johnson and Chasen Harrison. The day of the evacuation of Charleston, December 14th, was celebrated as a state holiday in the years following the Revolution. After around 1812, however, the celebrations seemed to fade away. South Carolina does not celebrate as a state holiday today. It's known by some locals as Victory Day, but you don't get the day off from work. That might have to do with the practicality of having yet another holiday between Thanksgiving and Christmas, but for the generation that actually lived through the Revolutionary War, December 14th was absolutely a time for celebration. The evacuation of Charleston is not well remembered, since it's going to be eclipsed by the larger evacuation of New York the following year. Sorry if that's a spoiler alert. But the departure of the 14,000 people was a major event. Consider that the entire population of Charleston before the war was only about 12,000. As I said in the main show, most of the civilians ended up settling in Jamaica or East Florida. Of course, when the final peace treaty handed over East Florida to Spain, most of those refugees ended up having to move once again. About 5,000 of those departing were of African descent. I haven't found a good breakdown on how many of the slaves of loyalist or British evacuees and how many were granted freedom, but the total was only a fraction of the estimated 25,000 slaves taken from South Carolinians during the war. A large number of these slaves had died, and another major portion of them had been removed from the state during the war before the evacuation. A massive number of these people were resold in British colonies in the West Indies. Those plantations tended to be particularly brutal and saw an extremely high death rate. Those who did obtain freedom tended to move to Canada. Many of those removed to Canada and Jamaica eventually settled in Sierra Leone, where Britain started a colony with former slaves in 1787. The colonists who settled there started by trying to take land from the native Africans, resulting in a bloody war. Later, after Britain and the U.S. banned the international slave trade in 1807, Sierra Leone became a dumping ground for slave ships that were seized in the Atlantic crossing. Locals would then purchase those slaves as apprentices who were required to work off their apprenticeship over several years. Jamaica also became a booming colony. Its sugar production grew substantially after the Revolutionary War, providing the majority of sugar for the British Empire. The bulk of the work was done by slaves, who outnumbered whites on the island by more than 30-1. Another interesting story that I didn't get into in the main show was that as soon as the Continental Army occupied Charleston, the Maryland line decided that its military service was over. They had signed up to serve until the end of the war, and now they considered the war at an end. General Greene had to force them to stay, arguing that the war was not over simply because the British had left South Carolina. These disappointed soldiers remained in service. Greene was concerned, with the enemy gone, the South Carolina Army all went home. Greene was left with only a few hundred Continentals and a concern that the British in Florida, along with their Indian allies, could still wreak havoc on the state. Congress was providing no food, clothing, or pay, and the local South Carolina government, which had briefly celebrated these men as liberators, now saw the Army as a problematic cost rather than the saviors who had delivered their freedom. The Army would not disband until July 1783. By that time, the starving soldiers were also facing another brutal wave of disease. Much of the Army actually ended up deserting before the final furlough in July, giving up any promise of veterans' benefits because they saw no end to their days of starvation and death from disease. One member of the Army who never left was William Washington. The cousin of the commander-in-chief had been taken prisoner at Utah Springs. While being held by the British, Washington married a local woman, Jane Riley Elliott. After the war, the couple purchased a townhouse in Charleston and owned several plantations in the area. Colonel Washington would go on to serve in the South Carolina legislature for nearly 2 decades and became a general in the South Carolina militia. My book recommendation this week is To the Last Extremity, The Battles for Charleston, 1776 to 1782, by Mark Malloy. This is a look at Charleston's entire journey through the Revolutionary War. It's a relatively short book, under 200 pages, and it was first published last year, 2023. The author, Malloy, is a historian for the National Park Service in Virginia. and this book is part of a larger Emerging Revolutionary War series. It really seems designed for people that plan to visit Charleston and want to understand the Revolutionary War history of the town as part of their visit. So if this sort of thing appeals to you, take a look at To the Last Extremity. My online recommendation is The Evacuation of Charleston by the British in 1782 by Joseph Barnwell. This was originally a magazine article published in the South Carolina Historical and Genealogical magazine in 1910. What I like about it is that it quotes extensively from eyewitness accounts of the evacuation, so it gives you a good primary witness view of the evacuation itself. It's available on archive.org, and as always, I've included direct links on my blog and website. My question this week is actually a timely one, as it comes from David Forensic, who has already been reading my book recommendation, To the Last Extremity. David asks about the reluctance of the Rutledges to support the Declaration of Independence in 1776, about Governor Rutledge's offer to take South Carolina out of the Union and become neutral when a British army threatened Charleston in 1779, and the efforts by Charleston's leaders to keep the Continental Army from abandoning Charleston during the British siege of 1780, thus resulting in the largest American surrender of the war. He asks, are these stories accurate, and if so, what was the reaction of the other 12 colonies and the Continental Army to this attitude of the South Carolina leadership to deny the spirit of the Revolution? Well, David, yes, the stories are accurate, at least based on what I've read in many other primary and secondary accounts. Let's start with the Declaration. There was a great deal of reluctance among many delegates to declare independence in 1776. Many thought there was a good chance the British would crush the rebellion rather quickly and make examples of the leaders by imprisoning or hanging them. Many leaders had entered this movement hoping that a show of resistance would force a political compromise with London that would address their concerns over taxation. Entering a war for full independence was a whole different level. John Rutledge showed some hesitation over full independence, as did his brother Edward Rutledge, who replaced him in the Congress after John Rutledge became governor of South Carolina in March of 1776. This reluctance was not unique to South Carolina, though. Many moderates from various states were reluctant to declare independence. In the end, though, Rutledge and the others supported it, and Edward Rutledge signed the Declaration. There were others who did not. John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, for example, opposed independence and did not sign the Declaration. Others, like Joseph Galloway of Pennsylvania, broke ranks and joined the Loyalists after the Americans went for independence. The fact that the Rutledges overcame their reluctance and did support independence, I think, is commendable. The 1779 offer of neutrality is a little harder to justify. I discussed this event in detail back in episode 220, so if you want to get the whole scoop on that, I suggest going back and re-listening to that episode, 220. But essentially, the British sent a relatively small force of about 2,000 regulars to the gates of Charleston. Governor Rutledge and others seemed ready to surrender and declared South Carolina neutral until the end of the war. Their offer only failed because the British commander, General Augustine Prevost, said he was not authorized to make any political deals. Now, essentially surrendering at the first sign of danger is not exactly what we would hope to see in our patriot leaders, but the reality is that politicians like trying to cut political deals. Rutledge and others feared the destruction of Charleston and were seeking to prevent that. We should also remember that other South Carolina leaders, like General William Moultrie and Colonel John Lawrence, strongly opposed this offer of neutrality. Finally, there is the issue of South Carolina leaders threatening to turn on the Continental Army if it abandoned Charleston when the British arrived in 1780 under General Clinton. The British had an overwhelming force, and a tactical withdrawal probably made sense for the Army, much like when General Washington gave up New York or Philadelphia. Rutledge and other leaders essentially forced General Lincoln to remain in Charleston and defend it, thus leading to the capture of the 5,000-man army. At that point, Charleston had already seen Georgia fall and saw themselves as next. This time, at least, they were willing to put up a fight, even if most of the fighting would be done by the Continentals. Southern state leaders had never worked well with the Continental officers in the South. The state leaders tended to be arrogant, demanding, and unwilling to cooperate. While this problem existed everywhere, I think that it was particularly pronounced in South Carolina. You ask, what did the other 12 colonies think of this? Well, I'm sure they weren't happy with it, but part of remaining united meant that they had to put up with the shortcomings of their allies in the other states. They could not fight with each other while they were fighting with the British. People are not always perfect, and good guys are not always doing the good thing. In the end, we still needed to work with each other to achieve the goal of creating a United States. Whatever differences our leaders had, they were willing to put aside to reach that greater goal. And fortunately, that was the final result. If you have a question you'd like me to answer, please reach out to me either via email or on Twitter, Facebook, Quora, or Reddit. Well, that's all for this week. I hope you will join me again next week for another American Revolution podcast.